Most people believe that philosophy and science in the Islamic world starts with the Greek translation movement, where Greek texts were translated into Arabic in the 9th century. But this is a myth. In fact, Islamic intellectual tradition starts from the late 7th century and early 8th century. In this video, we will analyze the origins and development of Islamic philosophy. And in the other episodes, we will talk about Islamic science and also the development of Islamic legal tradition. Professor Watt, in his book Formative Period of Islamic Thought, says, rationalism, or the use of reason in Islam, tends to be associated in the minds of Western scholars with the study of Greek philosophy in the Islamic world and its partial acceptance by theologians. This is a false impression. He further says, it seems likely that the appeal to the theologians of Greek philosophical concepts and methods was enhanced by the fact that they had already studied jurisprudence and there became familiar with rational forms of argumentation. Commenting on this, Professor Topgoy says, the methodology of early theological reflection initially reflected patterns of thought and methods of reasoning worked out in the indigenous disciplines of Quranic exegesis, tafsir, grammar, hadith, and law. This was because the men engaged in these early theological ruminations were first and foremost jurists who were required to know grammar and tafsir in order to engage fiqh. And lastly, he says, the early Muslims were primed to engage in such philosophical debates by virtue of the dialectical way of thinking that they had learned not only from the Quran and prophetic practice, but also from the early indigenous Islamic disciplines of tafsir, grammar, hadith, and law mentioned above. It is in the context of this intellectual backdrop that the first full-fledged, properly speculative theological discussions in Islam took place. The first such debate revolved around the questions of free will and determinism and influenced the manner in which various other questions of dogma were conceived and debated. To give another example, Professor Halak in his book Sharia, Theory, Practice and Transformation says, throughout the 8th century, the legally minded scholars employed Rai in their reasoning. Whether based on knowledge of the Sunnite practice or not, Rai encompassed a variety of inferential methods that ranged from loose reasoning to arguments of a strictly logical type, such as analogy or the argumentum a fortiori. Now, to summarize what these scholars are saying, the only reason that Muslim scholars were engaged in these deeply philosophical arguments was because they were already trained in Quranic tafsir, hadith, law, and grammar, which are indigenous Islamic disciplines. It was engagement in these disciplines that prepared them for rational argumentations in philosophy. In Islamic history, the Mu'tazilites are considered to be the earliest scholars who engaged in such philosophical questions. And it is because of this reason that Professor Adamson in his book Philosophy in the Islamic World says that the Mu'tazilis can be considered to be the first philosophers of Islam. He further says, the Mu'tazilites certainly were not spending most of their time reading Aristotle. Rather, these were theologians, and their sacred texts were not Hellenistic philosophical treatises, but actually sacred texts, the Quran and also the Hadith. The Mu'tazilis engaged questions like, does God have attributes? Is the Quran created or eternal? Do humans have free will? And other questions. Following the Muslim conquest of Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Egypt in the 8th century, Muslims also built garrison towns like Kufa, Basra, and Cairo. These garrison towns later became vibrant cities where Muslims interacted with Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and people from other religious communities. This created an intellectual melting pot where debates and discussions on theology, ethics, and metaphysics naturally flourished. It was in this vibrant multicultural setting that Islamic philosophy was born. The earliest form of Islamic philosophy was Kalam, a rational theology that emerged in the 8th century. It focused on divine justice, human agency, prophecy, and the nature of God. Kalam had three major schools: the Mu'tazilis, who were the earliest and most rationalist, the Asharis, who responded to the Mu'tazilites with a more traditional theology, and the Maturidis. Professor Adamson, in his book The Heirs of Avicenna, says Falsafa was the continuation of Greek philosophy in the Arabo-Islamic world, where the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus were translated into Arabic and then further commented by Christian and Muslim Arabs. The Falsafa tradition itself had two major schools: the Mashai, or the Peripatetics, and Ishraqi, or the Illuminationists. The Mashai includes figures like Ibn Sina and Al-Kindi. The Ishraqi schools include figures like Sohrawardi. Though Kalam and Falsafa had different foundations, they deeply influenced each other. Take Ibn Sina, for example, who was influenced by the Mu'tazili and Ashari theologians like Al-Juwayni and Abdul Jabbar, in his formulation of his powerful concept of the necessary versus contingent existence, which became central to Islamic metaphysics later on. Ibn Sina's greatest rival was Al-Ghazali, a scholar of the Asharite Kalam school. In his famous book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, he refutes 20 metaphysical claims of the Falsafa, and in particular, the peripatetic Falsafa. But one often unnoticed fact is, Imam Ghazali himself adopted many ideas from Ibn Sina, especially on prophecy, dream interpretation, and logic. Later, Imam Ghazali incorporates Aristotelian logic into the madrasa education, and he also wrote 4 books on logic. Another prevalent myth regarding Islamic intellectual history is that Falsafa is equated with the entirety of Islamic philosophy. In reality, Falsafa was the expression of only one kind of Islamic philosophy, and Kalam was certainly the earliest and also one of the most robust traditions of Islamic philosophy. And as Professor Griffith says, just because the etymological roots of Falsafa and Philosophia are the same, it doesn't mean that Falsafa alone captures the entirety of Islamic philosophy. In fact, philosophers from the Kalam tradition engaged these philosophical questions like God's existence, metaphysics, ontology, epistemology just as much, if not more, than the philosophers from the Falsafa tradition. As we will show in the next episodes, both Islamic philosophical traditions of Kalam and Falsafa developed and were studied all the way up to the 19th century from India to Morocco. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me stay motivated in making videos such as these.